My name is Cassie Turner. I'm 31, and until a few nights ago, I thought I understood what family meant. Not the perfect kind, just the basic version where people disagree, get loud sometimes, but still want you around. I held on to that idea for years, even when it stopped making sense. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was doing something painfully ordinary, stirring a pot of pasta, when my phone lit up. One message, 12 words, the kind that don't come from a stranger or an enemy, but from the person who raised you. We're done. Don't ever come back. I didn't blink. I didn't drop the spoon. I didn't even breathe for a second. My eyes just stayed on the screen because of what appeared right under it. A tiny thumbs up. A like. From someone who should have known better. Someone who'd benefited from my help more times than I could count. It was wild how fast everything sharpened. All the years I'd pushed aside my own plans, all the weekends I'd worked extra hours, all the payments I'd made without complaint. They lined up in my head like a row of receipts I'd never bothered to total. And there I was, standing in my kitchen, realizing a single text had finally done what nothing else could. It flipped a switch. Not in anger, not in fear, in clarity. I typed one short response. No emotion, no explanation, just the truth of what would happen next. And the moment I hit send, everything changed, faster than they ever expected, and far more than they were prepared for. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. A few years before that moment, everything had started quietly, without any dramatic shift, just a slow pull into responsibilities that weren't supposed to be mine. It began when my dad, Henry, lost his job. Not in some explosive scandal, just one layoff that stretched longer than anyone expected. My mom, Linda, was working fewer hours at the time, and their mortgage payment sat heavy on a house that was older than both of them combined. I was 27, working long hours at an operations desk, trying to scale my career. Back then, helping them felt like a simple bridge. 1 month, maybe two, until things steadied. I remember the first payment I covered. It wasn't meant to turn into a pattern. I just didn't want them drowning overnight. But once you catch someone right before they hit the water, they start expecting you to stay there with your arms out forever. Mom called the situation temporary, a word she used often enough that it started losing its meaning. Dad kept saying he was applying to everything. Neither of them said it outright, but I could feel the weight shifting toward me, inch by inch. By the end of the first year, making their mortgage payments had become a routine built into my calendar the same way my rent and student loans were. I didn't resent it then. Not really. It just felt like something the responsible child was supposed to do, and I'd always been that child. Somewhere around year 2, the strain tightened. My younger brother, Evan, was working at a warehouse job, sometimes full-time, sometimes not, depending on how often he overslept or switched schedules. His spending habits didn't match his paychecks. Credit cards came first, then the overdraft fees, the late notices. Each time, Mom insisted he was just figuring things out. Each time, the figuring out somehow involved me. Eventually, I was asked to co-sign a small consolidation loan so he could reset. I agreed because I thought structure might help him grow up. Instead, the payments kept landing in my lap when he slipped. I didn't tell anyone at work about what I was juggling. The only person who sensed something was off was my friend Ethan, who sat across from me in the office. He'd glance at me when I stared too long at spreadsheets, as if trying to measure the exhaustion behind my eyes. But I never explained the truth. It felt too tangled, and I was too embarrassed to admit how deeply I'd tied myself into knots for people who barely said thank you. Around the 3rd year, I'd been dating Paul for a while. He was steady, patient, and more observant than I gave him credit for. He noticed the way I postponed plans whenever my family called. He noticed how tense I grew each time my banking alerts buzzed. He wanted a future with me, one that included a home, a dog, maybe even kids. I wanted those things too, but my finances were scattered across obligations that weren't supposed to be mine. The conversations between us grew shorter, and the silences grew longer, until one day he said he couldn't build anything with someone who was already building 3 lives for other people. It wasn't cruel, it was honest, and he walked away. After that, I focused on work, telling myself I'd rebuild later. But each month the payments kept coming, and my family kept slipping further into the habit of leaning on me even when they didn't need to. I didn't push back. I didn't draw lines. I told myself it was easier to hold everything together than risk watching it crumble. What I didn't realize then was that the crumbling would come anyway, just not in the direction I expected. The tension that eventually surfaced had been building long before I was willing to recognize it. It showed itself fully 2 weeks before the message, during a Sunday dinner at my parents' house. I had driven over after a long week, thinking it would be a quick meal and an early night. Their living room looked the same as always: family photos, old furniture, the faint smell of something in the oven. But the air between us carried an edge that wasn't there before. Mom greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Dad stayed in his chair, scrolling on his phone. Evan walked in late, keys jingling, looking pleased with himself in a way that usually meant he had done something irresponsible and hoped no one would ask. I took my seat at the table, trying to shake the sense that I'd been summoned rather than invited. Dinner started normally enough. Small talk, work updates, nothing heavy. But Mom shifted the conversation as soon as the plates were full. She talked about how Evan needed a break, how he'd been under pressure, how the family deserved something positive to look forward to. I listened, waiting for her point, because she never laid out her real intentions until she'd softened the ground first. Then she mentioned a trip, an out-of-state getaway she thought would help Evan reset. She described hotel options, the cost of flights, and the way she hoped everyone could go together. Dad nodded occasionally, though it was clear he hadn't thought about logistics at all. Evan leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who assumed the details would fall into place for him like they always had. Mom finally looked directly at me when she got to the part that mattered. She didn't ask outright. She framed it as if I'd volunteered. She talked about how much I loved treating the family, how grateful they always were for my support, how this would be a chance for us to reconnect. All her words were warm, but the expectation underneath them was cold and solid. I didn't answer at first. I just felt something tighten inside me, something that had gone unnoticed for years but had now snapped awake. Mom's expression changed when she realized I wasn't immediately on board. She repeated herself, slower this time, as if I hadn't understood. Dad finally looked up. Evan stared at his plate, trying to act neutral, but clearly waiting for me to agree. When I said no, the room shifted. Mom blinked, then frowned, as though I had broken an unspoken rule. She asked if I was serious. Dad muttered something about how family should help family. Evan's silence turned into a stare that felt almost accusatory. I kept my voice steady, but inside, everything churned. For the first time, I didn't soften my answer or offer a compromise. I simply refused. The reaction was instant. Mom started listing everything she believed she had done for me. Dad sighed loudly, disappointed in a way that suggested I had betrayed him. Evan pushed his chair back, pacing in small circles like he couldn't process being denied something he assumed was already his. Their frustration grew together, loud and overlapping, until it felt like the entire room was closing in. I didn't argue. There was nothing to defend. I had spent years stretching myself thin, and they had stretched their expectations even further. Sitting there, listening to the rising swell of criticism, I felt a strange mix of sadness and clarity. I realized this was no longer a family dinner. It was a verdict they had reached long before I walked in. I stood up, took my coat, and left the house without another word. The night was quiet outside, so quiet it felt unreal after the noise inside. I drove home with a numbness I couldn't name, not knowing it would be the last time I sat at their table. In the days that followed, I slipped back into my routine, though nothing felt routine anymore. I carried a quiet heaviness that clung to me even in moments that should have felt ordinary. It wasn't about the dinner itself. It was the realization that the dynamic I'd brushed aside for years had been sitting in plain sight, waiting for me to confront it. I threw myself into work, hoping structure would settle my mind. It did the opposite. Every spreadsheet, every meeting, every muted conversation reminded me of how much time I'd spent shaping my life around responsibilities that weren't mine. I'd never called it sacrifice, but seeing everything so clearly now, that was exactly what it had been. It was during one of those long afternoons that I thought about Paul again. We had dated for 3 years, steady and uncomplicated at first, then slowly strained by the demands my family put on me. He had been patient in ways I didn't appreciate at the time. He tried to understand the late-night phone calls, the money that seemed to vanish every month, the endless emergencies that never stopped being emergencies. But patience has limits. His did too. I remembered the evening he sat across from me at my own kitchen table, trying to explain how it felt to watch me dedicate everything I had to people who gave nothing back. His frustration wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. He told me he wanted a future with me, a home, stability, something that belonged to both of us, not a life built around cleaning up after other adults. I didn't argue with him then. I didn't defend myself. I just didn't know how to stop what I'd been doing for so long. The breakup happened quietly. No shouting, no final confrontation, just a gentle ending from someone who couldn't keep waiting for me to choose a life that included him. I didn't blame him. I still don't. But losing him had left an empty space I didn't allow myself to acknowledge until now. As I drove home after work, the memories kept coming. I thought about every just for now payment, every request framed as temporary, every new crisis that arrived the moment the previous one faded. I had told myself I was helping because I cared, and that was true. But beneath that was a quieter truth I'd never said out loud. I was terrified of what would happen if I stopped. Maybe that fear was exactly why my family leaned on me so heavily. They knew I wouldn't let things fall apart. They knew I wouldn't let the house slip into default, or let the lights get shut off, or let Evan face the messes he created for himself. They trusted that I would hold everything up even if it crushed me, and I had. Thinking about it now, I realized how each step had taken me further away from my own life. I had postponed buying a home because their mortgage had drained my savings. I had hesitated about promotions that required relocation because I convinced myself they needed me close. I had pushed aside my own plans until they barely resembled plans at all. By the time I parked outside my apartment, I understood the weight I had been carrying. It wasn't simply financial pressure. It was the constant expectation that I would fix everything, absorb everything, withstand everything. Somewhere along the way, responsibility had turned into obligation, and obligation had turned into duty that no one asked about, only depended on. Inside my apartment, I sat down without turning on the lights. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider what my life might look like if I stopped trying to be the solution to every problem my family created. The thought wasn't freeing yet. It felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, the way newness often does. But the idea was there now, rooted, undeniable. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to picture something different. The shift I felt inside me didn't disappear. It settled deeper over the next several days, becoming something steady rather than fleeting. By midweek, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I sat at my kitchen counter one evening with my laptop open. not out of habit, but because I needed to see the truth laid out in front of me. I pulled up my financial records, the ones I had gotten used to skimming without thinking. This time, I looked closely. Line after line of monthly transfers filled the screen. Regular, predictable, automatic. Each number represented a promise I had made without ever deciding if it was mine to keep. The largest category was the mortgage payment. Every month, without fail, a chunk of my income disappeared into that house. It had started under the label of temporary support, a phrase I had repeated so many times that it no longer sounded like a lie. I had told myself I was giving them time, space, stability. But as I stared at the transaction history stretching back years, I saw it for what it really was, the slow erosion of my own stability. Right below it were the installments for Dad's vehicle loan, another temporary arrangement that had quietly become permanent. I remembered how convinced he had been that everything would sort itself out if he could just get through a rough patch. That rough patch had turned into a routine I carried alone. The payments never bounced, never paused, never even drifted late, because I was the one making them. Then there were the transfers tied to Evan. Smaller amounts, but frequent. His emergencies always arrived with urgency: job setbacks, overdue statements, unexpected fees that magically appeared without warning. Each time, I had stepped in before consequences caught up to him. My support had smoothed out the bumps in his life while creating a permanent crater in mine. Seeing it all at once made my stomach tighten. Not because I hadn't known, but because I had avoided acknowledging just how much space their needs had taken up in my life. It wasn't just the money. It was the emotional load, the constant vigilance, the sense that everything in the family would fall apart if I didn't keep every piece in place. I scrolled through the columns until the total stared back at me. I didn't need the exact figure to understand its weight. The accumulation told its own story, one in which I had been cast as the caretaker, the buffer, the one who absorbed every impact so no one else had to. As I sat there, a strange calm washed over me. It wasn't relief. Not yet. It was clarity, the kind that arrives when you finally stop pretending. I realized I had been waiting for something, an apology, a moment of recognition, even a simple acknowledgement of what I had given. But none of that was going to come. The pattern wasn't going to change by itself. They weren't going to wake up one morning suddenly aware of what they had asked from me. If I wanted something different, I would have to be the one to choose it. I closed the laptop and leaned back, letting the quiet fill the room. For years, I had convinced myself that stepping back would make me selfish, but sitting there, surrounded by the evidence of how much I had carried, I felt something shift. This wasn't selfishness. This was survival. And for the first time, I realized I no longer felt guilty imagining a life where I wasn't responsible for everyone else. The moment that forced everything into motion arrived quietly, much quieter than I would have imagined after years of carrying the weight of their expectations. It happened on a Thursday evening, just as I was settling into the kind of calm I had rarely allowed myself to feel. My phone buzzed, a single vibration that didn't seem urgent at first. I glanced at the screen expecting something routine. It wasn't. The message was short, almost abrupt. My mother wrote that they were done and that I shouldn't come back. There was no explanation, no hesitation in the phrasing, only a finality that made the room feel smaller. A moment later, another notification appeared. Evan had tapped the like icon beneath her message, putting his approval in a place I couldn't ignore. For a long breath, I didn't move. I just stared at the words that had broken whatever illusion of stability I still held. There was no shock. Not really. What I felt was closer to recognition, as if the truth had finally caught up with the way things had been shifting for years. A decision I had never made for myself had now been made for me, typed out without ceremony and sent off like an afterthought. When I looked away from the screen, The room around me seemed unchanged, but something inside me had rearranged itself completely. The exhaustion I had ignored for years surfaced all at once, not in waves, but as a steady, grounding weight. Instead of reacting in the way they might have expected, panic, bargaining, apologies, I felt an unusual steadiness. A quiet, firm understanding settled into place, and I knew I wasn't going to fight the message I'd just read. I set the phone down and let the silence grow around me. It wasn't empty. It felt deliberate. I could almost sense the years of unspoken pressure loosening. For so long, my life had revolved around preventing chaos. Now that chaos had been delivered directly to my doorstep by the very people I had worked so hard to protect, and the absurdity of it created a kind of clarity I hadn't known I was capable of feeling. Later that night, I picked up my phone again, not to respond, but to see what else would come. More messages appeared, each one harder in tone than the last. There were brief statements, vague implications, passive disappointment delivered in short lines that didn't say much, but carried the weight of long-held patterns. Not one of them asked if I was okay. Not one expressed concern or reconsideration. They simply closed a door and assumed I would stand outside it, waiting to be let back in. But I didn't. Instead, I watched the notifications accumulate until I stopped counting. Each one felt like a quiet confirmation of what I had been avoiding for years. The thread of family obligation I had clung to out of duty, or fear, was frayed beyond repair now. I wasn't the one who cut it. They had done that themselves, and they did it with remarkable ease. Hours passed before I finally turned the phone face down on the table and allowed myself to sit still. The stillness didn't hurt. It didn't frighten me. It felt like the first moment in a long time that truly belonged to me. Their finality created space. Space that I had never permitted myself to take before. And in that space, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't grieving the loss of the relationship they had chosen to end. I was grieving the years I had spent believing it was my job to hold everything together. And once that truth settled, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. The next morning arrived quietly, and with it came a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I moved through my apartment with purpose, not out of anger, but out of understanding. Understanding that something had finally ended and something else had begun. I opened my banking app and made the changes one by one. The mortgage transfer disappeared from the schedule with a single tap. The recurring payment for Dad's vehicle loan vanished next. Every automatic withdrawal tied to Evan was canceled without hesitation. The simplicity of the process felt surreal, almost too easy for something that had defined so much of my life. When I finished, there was no thrill, no regret, only the unmistakable feeling of reclaiming a part of myself I had ignored for far too long. Then I typed the only message I planned to send. A brief confirmation that the financial responsibility they had relied on was no longer mine to carry. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't cruel, it was factual, direct, and final. After sending it, I placed my phone aside and let the silence make its own space. The reaction didn't take long. Hours later, a storm of notifications filled my screen. Missed calls, long paragraphs broken into frantic bursts, half-formed explanations, accusations disguised as concern, and concern disguised as disappointment. I didn't open them. What they had written the night before had already closed the conversation. This was simply the echo of a pattern I no longer intended to participate in. Over the next few days, reality began catching up to them in ways I had predicted but never wished for. The mortgage company contacted them first. Without the payment I had been making, the balance was now fully their responsibility. The next correspondence came from the lender handling Dad's vehicle loan. I knew how strict those agencies could be. Missed payments rarely went unnoticed. As for Evan, the small crises he never managed to face began stacking faster than he could cover them. None of it surprised me. These were consequences that had always belonged to them. I had just shielded them from experiencing it. I didn't step in. I didn't explain myself. I didn't attempt to soften the impact. For once, they had to navigate the outcomes of their own choices without assuming I would arrive to absorb the damage. And though the situation carried a heaviness, it wasn't mine to carry anymore. In the quiet that followed, I realized how much space had opened up inside me, space I had been too exhausted to imagine before. I started taking long walks after work, not because I needed to clear my head, but because I finally had room in my life for things that weren't obligations. I cooked meals without rushing. I slept without the constant fear of an emergency message lighting up my phone. I allowed myself to think about the future without immediately subtracting pieces of it to make room for someone else's needs. There were moments when the old instinct tugged at me, urging me to check on them, to see how bad things had become. But I didn't. I reminded myself that stepping back wasn't abandonment. It was correction, long overdue correction of a role I was never meant to fill. As days stretched into a quiet rhythm, I reached a truth I hadn't expected to find. Sometimes the greatest peace doesn't come from fixing what's broken, but from finally accepting it isn't yours to repair. And if there is a lesson in all this, it's that boundaries aren't punishments. They are lifelines, ones we often forget we're allowed to hold. You can care for people without sacrificing yourself. You can love family without losing your sense of self in the process. And sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is simply step out of the way and let others face what belongs to them. Thank you for listening to my story. If it reached you at the right moment, I hope it reminds you that protecting your own life is not selfish. It's necessary.